can you like explain this term? So feel free to do that. Today we're going to be talking about group dynamics and polarization and how they contribute to conflict, but also because this presentation is part of the dialogue facilitation school that we had in Gori. We'll also be talking about what to do if you want to have dialogue or any kind of complicated conversation that identity, groups, and polarization is impacting. So I think that's it. I think we can start. So also, actually, this is really funny. So Masha Petrukhina is here, and she's already seen a version of this presentation in Russian. So uh, you might, yeah, you have spoilers, but don't spoil it for anyone. Okay. So this is me. Hello. I know most of you, but some of you I don't know. I'm originally from Canada, but I've lived in St. Petersburg. I was based in Russia for something like 7 years, so I was kind of traveling back and forth. But now I've been living in Tbilisi for the past 2.5 years. By training, I'm a freelance writer, and then after that, I was working as a journalist. Also a big hitchhiker. As you can see in the picture, I liked origami. Now maybe not so much, but this was definitely a hobby for a while. I speak English and Russian, but also I've been working as a dialogue facilitator since about 2017, on and off in different projects. And when I say dialogue, I'm talking about a specific kind of communication that we have between people in conflict, where we try to generate mutual understanding, understand each other, and get to know each other's stories more, rather than say convince each other or attack each other or fight each other. So I facilitate group sessions where we do this kind of thing. Also, I have a bit of a background in peace research. So the Oslo in the picture is a hitchhiking sign because I studied peace research at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. So it's not just about the fun birds made of paper. I'm affiliated with a Canadian organization called Ottawa Dialogue, and I also help out and do work with the Mediation and Dialogue Research Center in Kiev. And my interests are in polarization, in like dialogue as a practice, but also when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate, in group dynamics, in what we call culture war, um, which is kind of like a mostly non-violent ideological kind of conflict. And then also, I'm really interested in competing types of peace. So when different groups have their vision of peace, and they fight with each other about whose peace is better. So this is also something I'm really interested in. So what about you guys? Um, what are what brought you here, and more importantly, what's your interest in group dynamics or polarization come from? Is it like life? Is it like stuff that you see online? Are you activists? Do you have other projects? Feel free to unmute yourselves and just speak, because this will help me understand what you guys are interested in. And like if all of you are academics and not practitioners, then I would talk more about that. But if most of you guys are like practitioners, or maybe none of you are activists, who knows? And you're just like, who knows? So yeah, just like why are you here today? And what spheres are you from, other than just coming to see me? And hello to all those who came to see me. You don't have to raise your hand, just speak up.
Oh, well, since no one is talking, I can start. Well, Masha already unmuted, but I can start. Hi, everyone. I think most of people know me. I am, in fact, writing an essay on conflict now, but so I'm both in academics and activism. And yeah, I'm super interested in peace building and conflicts from both theoretical and practical approaches. And I'm very excited to listen to your talk today, Josh. Yeah, we've been colleagues in different projects, and Yeah, I was a student of Josh in this civil facilitation course last year. I learned a lot. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dasha. Masha.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've been identifying as a civil activist for, I don't know, maybe 15 years. And as I worked in Greenpeace, I saw that I am very like in my bubble of civil activists. Like I mostly communicate with people kind of like me. And it was I saw that I'm kind of polarizing. Like I'm not starting to thinking like we and they and like we are different and so on. And what struck me most is that we live together on this planet, and we definitely need to cooperate to solve all the problems we've got, like as a humanity. And this is kind of impossible if we continue thinking of we and they and something like this. So I don't know. You asked all these questions, and like I've got so many topics where I see the polarization. It's like it's horrible. Yeah, but maybe what I kind of feel the most is people who think that they can change something in society and people who think that they cannot.
Mhm.
And they kind of sometimes like argue with each other, like what you do is make no sense and so on. And of course, anything about queer work and so on, it's very polarizing.
Mhm.
And for me, it was very interesting that I met it in nonviolent communication community. So in the places I thought that it will not be any like questions about it. So it's a lot of things. And um, also now in immigration, I feel very like not like polarization, but division between people who struggle with money and people who kind of have um, like financial security. And I realize uh, being in the group of those who struggle, I realize how profoundly it affects me and my mental health and what I think about and what I care about and what I have like energy for. So I kind of started to think a bit different about this polarizing topic.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. Alan.
So I'm pretty recent to this space, and I think this is the space that I've been involved in, just online since the start of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So it's just been involved online with people. But the way I see, just like I've said that things like people say that there's systemic racism and systemic this, systemic that. But to me, ultimately, there are people that make those systems happen. So even, any kind of dynamic between two individuals, that's a group dynamic. So for me, it's
Mhm.
just understanding any interactions between it could be two individuals. So thank you for today.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. Aliona.
Um, yeah, hi everyone. I'm an environmentalist, so a lot like Masha. I worked in WWF, which is for everyone else probably the same. For us, it's a bit different. Um, my vision for my profession was to have like a very peaceful desk research for practice, but with like being Russian, you can't just do anything environmental without becoming an activist and an outlaw. So unfortunately, yeah, we have to be activists now, and it's always in my practice always been a strong correlation with human rights and with mediation of some sort. So, and especially the like the WWF approach is always to like get into the decision-making rooms and try to be one of the stakeholders of the decisions. And I've always thought of mediation as a kind of expertise that I need to get. But with the full-scale war, of course, it just became everywhere. And it's not just online bullshit. It's just a part of my life till the end. You know, I will always have to mediate conflicts. I'm like a side of a conflict that will be ongoing. So yeah, I'm very interested in mediation and polarization and everything that's in there in your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you,
Both
Alyona.
academically and practically.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for sharing your context. So we've heard kind of a broad range from like personal like conversations that people have that are polarized. For some people, it's in the organizations they work with or like with their activism. For some people, they're talking about these large geopolitical polarizations like Russia and Ukraine, also like migration and stuff. Gleb also put a comment in the chat, so feel free also to read what he wrote. Today, obviously, okay, you could talk about this on so many levels. Today, because again, our facilitation school in Gori, we're trying to teach people skills. So today we're going to focus on more this kind of like personal or organizational level. People do try to make interventions on a more kind of like broader, like large group level, but that would have to be like a whole other session. And if you're interested, feel free. We can talk about it during the question period and the discussion. But just to say that we'll be focusing on how is it kind of like how does it arise in the brain? How do groups impact us? And what kinds of behaviors emerge from that? And then also how can we be in a conversation with somebody who's polarized? And what are things that we can do to try to make that conversation I don't want to say more productive because I think that like I if somebody's like polarized or like emotional or whatever, like often these are words that we use to judge people. But often this comes from like some kind of experience, right? Or some kind of like felt threat or something else like that. So like if you want to have a conversation that veers more towards like peace building or trying to find space for both or trying to find space for multiple stories, like these are things we'll be talking about today. So, yeah, okay. So context. We're going to be having, we have a couple different sections here. So, I need to minimize all your faces so I can see representation. So first is, yeah, like why, like of all the different things that cause conflicts, like why are we talking about group identity and polarization? And then I'll be talking about 5 points of how like identity and polarization emerge and mix and kind of create conflict. Also what happens to our brains when we're polarized, and then dialogue, like how can we respond in conversation when polarization is a factor, and then we will have time for discussion about how this stuff shows up in your life and work, and also to answer any questions, but also share your stories if anything has kind of resonated with you or reminds you of things that have happened, and we'll have time to share as well. So first, I want to say kind of like where a lot of this information is coming from. So first, a lot of this like a lot of this information like is basically a combination of like academic research and practice. So I have a master's in peace and conflict studies, And there's like so much research out there on identity-based conflicts and like polarization and stuff like that. But also from the practitioner side of like how can we make this information like more useful for us. I'm not going to have like any references. So if you're curious about like where you can read up on stuff like this, feel free to write me. But this is more again through the practitioner lens, but it's very informed by the research. Also, uh, I suggested doing this topic because with some folks here in this chat, we're part of one group that writes a zine about like leftist responses to cancel culture and things like that. And so this presentation was originally an article in that. So we're not going to be talking about cancel culture today, but a lot of the like everything that we're talking about here is laid out in more detail there. And so if you're interested in getting more into the topic, I can send you a copy either in English or in Russian. Okay. So again, like when we're talking about conflict, conflict can emerge from all sorts of different factors. So and we're talking about like group conflicts, not just like person-to-person conflict, although this is it's definitely like connected. So like conflict can emerge because there's narratives. We tell ourselves a story about the other that like, oh, they're dangerous, or oh, they're inhuman, or we need to attack them, otherwise they're going to kill us. And these are stories that kind of like can like lead to conflict. Also, unmet needs, especially scarcity, can encourage people, like especially groups, to mobilize into conflict. Power asymmetries. Some groups have more power than other groups, and when they have incompatible interests or positions, they often like run into conflict. Or, for example, there's histories of like justice or oppression, and the conflict emerges as a response to that. So it's like these are all different things that we could be talking about instead of polarization. So I don't want to say that polarization is the root of all conflict or the root of all group conflict. But like if you want to have conversations, either just as yourself, or if you want to be a facilitator or a mediator, we have to understand how conflict works, and how a specific conflict works. And when, so this is just like a presentation about one of the different pillars that can like give rise to conflict. But if we want to be good facilitators and effective peace builders, we want to learn about all these different things. But why polarization and group dynamics? For me, obviously, like I have a big research interest in this because the community that I come from has expressed a lot of polarization, and so there's like a personal reason behind that. But I think a lot of us have experience of polarization. Also, if there's a high degree of polarization in a society, it's much easier to mobilize people to do something. And it's also really important here that this isn't always bad, right? Like, for some people, like, let's go back here. For some people, like, power asymmetries or injustice are more important than polarization. But if people are polarized, activists, for example, can mobilize people against the other side if the other side is doing something that's like really, really, really not good, right? So polarization can like help some people's activism, right? So for some people, polarization is not the priority. Maybe the injustice is the priority, or the unmet needs is the priority, or imbalanced power structures is the priority. So again, I don't want to say that like like we all have to think about polarization first. Like you have to think about what your priorities are. But it really is a key factor in mobilizing people as a whole. Three, it's something that starts like in our brains in a lot of ways, and we're going to be talking about this here. And so like a lot of us have experience of having been polarized in some way or the other. And like lastly, it makes all of these other kinds of conflict more likely to happen when there's polarization there. So that's why I like focus on it, like especially in my practice. But again, other people focus on different things, and that's also okay. So if we want to talk about polarization, we have to talk about like the kind of polarization that we're talking about. We have to talk first about identity. So there's like so much written about identity, and so if you're an identity scholar, you're going to be very angry with my simplification here. But like an individual identity is our sense of what makes us different from other people, right? Like what makes me, what makes me unique. And group identity, it's something similar. So it's like what's something that makes one group different from other groups. And so we often have classic classic group identities, especially when it comes to conflict resolution. People are often thinking about ethnicity, race, religion, political affiliation, culture, your ideology. All of these can form the basis for group identities. But also we can form group identities like based on your job or like, I don't know, what music you like or whatever. And for some people, like these non-classic group identities can still be like really, really, really powerful. So when yeah, okay. So basically like when we're talking about how identity emerges in society and in conflict, it's like like identity is the thing that separates me from you, right? And when we're talking about things on a group level, it separates us and them. And this doesn't necessarily lead to conflict or hostility, right? Um, like in the best case situation, um, having different groups, like like the different groups are able to kind of see each other as like a really nice kind of diversity, right? Not every single different kind of identity is going to be like attacking each other. But you could actually, it's I never thought about this before, but like maybe there's like an interesting spectrum where it's like positive group identity or positive group relations is about like diversity and like negative is kind of like this negative polarization. I don't know. That's something that just kind of came up right now. But basically we're talking about the things that separate us from each other on a group level. And you know, like when we're talking about these like classic group markers, these are things that some people might think are essential about us, but these are ultimately also stories that we tell ourselves. Like it's a construct that we have, like, okay, I am different from you in this way, and this is important. So it's like, I don't want to say that these are like things that are unchangeable facts about ourselves, but these are things that are produced by the cultures and the societies that we're in. But just because they're constructed or produced doesn't mean that they're that like just because they're constructed in this way doesn't mean that they're easy to ignore or easy to like not be triggered by. So this is a there's another really really important difference here. So you can have characteristics that are associated with a group, and that's different from identifying with a group. So for example, like the examples here are like I believe in God, I don't eat meat, I'm from Poland. These are either actions or like facts about certain things about our life, right? And because of those things, someone might put us or think about us as part of a group. But maybe we see ourselves as part of the group, maybe we don't, right? It's just like it's something that's like a fact about our lives. In the second category here, it's like when we consciously identify with a group, not just I believe in God, but like I'm a believer, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, I'm a Hindu, or I'm a vegetarian, I'm Polish. And like when you guys see like these two things, like these two categories, do you see why why there's a like why these are different? Like why does it matter that these are two different things? That's a question for you. You can answer them. Is there a difference between saying I don't eat meat and saying I'm a vegetarian? Masha.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a difference because when you identify as a vegetarian, this implies other vegetarians. Oh, sorry for my dog. Yes, so there is a group, and
Mm-hmm.
you represent that group, and this also tells us that you agree with that group to some extent, or else you will speak only for yourself. So I think that's it. Also, there usually is like a package deal for beliefs, I think, and for identities. And when you say, I'm a vegetarian, this may mean that you not only you subscribe to not eating meat, but maybe you subscribe to something else also.
Perfect. I definitely agree with everything that you said there. I like also this part about the package deal, right? Because if somebody says like, I believe in God, like, and if they practice different Christian traditions, but if they say I'm a Christian, maybe that also kind of includes these different like moral beliefs, right? Like maybe that means they have to feel a certain way about like certain actions or certain behaviors or certain decisions, right? And so when we identify with a group, often there's like yeah, like there's this whole package of things, and also maybe then we can start thinking, oh, am I a good vegetarian? Right? Like, am I a bad vegetarian? There might also be this moral aspect or this value-based aspect where it's like, if I take on this identity, this means I should do something, right? Or I should be like something. That's also something um, that's like an important part of the difference here. So we have three more hands up. Let's, if we can keep them quick, that would be perfect. So first Masha, then Dasha, then Leon.
Yeah, I mostly wanted to say the same, but one also thing is, sorry for my English, by the way. Today it's very hard for me to speak English. So it's about sometimes I kind of say I'm a feminist, for example, um, just for people to easy understand like what I'm talking about. So it's kind of simpler, easier to say one word to explain what is my position on some topic or something. But I now, because you paid attention to these things, to these differences, I'm thinking like, oh my God, I shouldn't say like that. Like, there are so many different feminist people, and I think maybe sometimes when I say I'm a feminist, the person who I'm talking with can understand something very different, like suppose something about me which is not true. So it's very interesting. And also, of course, I really hard to understand this difference. Talking like I try to not say I'm Russian, and people always say you're Russian, like, about me. So I don't identify as Russian. I didn't identify like this before the war. So it's like I say like I am Russian citizen, like I've got Russian citizenship. It's not, it's more about this possessing characteristics, but not about my identity. Thank you for paying attention to these differences.
Thank you. Dasha.
I think our main difference for me is that on the left side you have an action, and you can, it's a practice that you do, and you might just stop doing it. Well, believe in God is a little bit different, but still, like I don't eat meat. I can stop not eating and start eating. And also being from is like I come from. Well, it's harder there, but yeah, I think when it's an action that you can stop doing, it's an active verb that you do, and that's different from the right side where it's like it's ingrained in you. You can't stop being yourself. You are
Mhm.
you.
Yeah, this is super important. Also, kind of with like with what Masha was saying before about like you might not identify with something, but people identify you with it, right? And if you identify with something, like if you identify like with vegetarianism, it's um, yeah, it becomes like something that's like connected to your like your soul or something, right? Like to your essence, or that you kind of present in this way. Versus, yeah, like Dash was talking about everything in the left column, like as kind of actions. I call them processes, right? Like we can, it's not all, it's not everything about us, right? Um, like versus if we say like I am something, then it kind of also shows a certain importance of this to our life. So, for example, if I'm a person who doesn't like vegetarians, I'm much more likely not to like somebody who says they're a vegetarian than somebody who just doesn't eat meat. So, like our relationship with each other, like depending on the labels we put on ourselves, this is pretty important. Aliona.
I can definitely understand what you mean here conceptually. And the example that comes to my mind from like a real life is that a lot of my queer friends, when they were in the process of coming out, they would a lot of the time start with saying, I sleep with women, but saying I'm a lesbian is a different thing. Like, because it's a taboo, you have to sort of like put a label on yourself, right? So there are a lot of barriers in acquiring this identity. It's easier to say I sometimes sleep with women because I'm so open-minded or whatever, and it's another thing to kind of like own the identity. But at the same time, I look at your examples and I understand that I use them interchangeably often. And when I say I'm Russian and I'm from Russia, I grew up in Russia, I have Russian citizenship, definitely don't mean that I share, like, I'm like other Russians. So I think, yeah, it doesn't always work like that on practice.
Yeah, I think this is super important. Also, like, again, I'm really happy that there's no academic identity researchers here because, like, a lot of this is a very, uh, like, simplistic presentation of this stuff. Um,
We have
and
answers in the chat.
Lovely. I it would be I think we'll have to move on right now, but like everyone definitely like look at like read those answers and see what other people are talking about. Um, but so yeah, like there's a lot of nuances. And for some people, it's really important that they say like that they only say I don't eat meat rather than they're vegetarian, or that they only say they're vegetarian. For some people, it doesn't matter so much. But what I want to say is that there are a number of things that happen in our brains and in our behavior when we do consciously identify with a group. And this is what we're talking a little bit more right now. But yeah, and so like the term that we use for, or like in the literature at least, the term that we use for the group that we identify with is called the in-group. And this is like opposed to the out-group. And like people can associate us with certain in-groups that we don't necessarily identify with, like we kind of said already. But but yeah, like this is the terminology that we're normally using for the groups that we identify with and the groups that we don't identify with. And there are a lot of like again, we're talking about polarization and conflict, and so we're going to be talking about a lot of the negative sides to identifying with groups or feeling like a part of a group. But there are lots of benefits, like feeling like you belong, connecting with people over shared experiences. For some people, being part of a group gives them a sense of purpose or meaning. It helps them build like relationships. It helps them keep kind of like socially connected, and this also can regulate mental health. But also, especially if the group is made of people who are vulnerable or who are in context of oppression, like seeing themselves as part of a group can help them to like mobilize and work against the oppression, right? And even if you're not part of that group, looking at it through the lens of in-group and out-group can help you have solidarity for groups that are being oppressed, right? So again, like this isn't like a good thing, bad thing. Um, uh, like like groupthink is bad or like groupthink is good. It's just like there are positives and negatives. And I think again, if we're thinking about peace building and conflict and dialogue, it's good to be aware of these processes and how they can impact something. So I see Masha, your hand. If it's possible to write in the chat because I definitely want to get through everything and then leave more time for discussion. So if you could write write the question in the chat, and hopefully we'll or your comment in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time for that as we move along. But yeah, so again, there are all these positive things, but there's more. Identifying with groups, and this is like consciously identifying with a group can can open us up to certain kinds of bullshit, right? That can like lead us into conflict. And again, it's not all bad, and it doesn't all happen at once. But it's like good to be aware. So the first point that I want to talk about in terms of how polarization and group dynamics emerge is that number one, we often take on characteristics of the groups that we identify with. So this picture is of a very specific drink called Club Mate. Many of you know it. Many of you love it. Many of you are completely indifferent to it. Something that I found in myself, there is one group that is very dear to my heart. That Club Mate was kind of like this inner, like this meme in a group. Like a lot of people were saying they loved it, and in my head, I'm like, okay, whatever. It's kind of expensive. Like it tastes okay. Like it's not like a big deal. But I found that the more I was hanging out with this group, like I don't know, like when I would go to a bar and I see Club Mate, there was this almost like instinctual reaction, like, oh, I have to buy that. Like, oh, like we have to get like the Club Mate. And it's like it's literally a group preference that just like that that I accepted unconsciously. And this is just on the level of a drink preference, right? But this happens to us not just in terms of like what haircuts we have or what drinks we do or like what cars we drive or like depending on like whatever. Like it can also happen with like values, beliefs, norms, and the opinions that we have of others. And this is something that can happen to us even if we are aware of it and even if we think the thing doesn't make sense, right? So even though rationally I know that like, okay, like Club Mate is whatever, like on the level of like my body or whatever, or like my unconscious mind, like I'm still kind of like receiving this group influence. It doesn't happen with everything. I don't want to say that you're going to join a group, you're going to identify with a group, and then like, oh, you're going to love everything that the group loves. But you just become more vulnerable to the thing. Like, I don't know if vulnerable is the right word, but you become more impressionable to certain things, right? And for example, even if there's like a value that's held by many people in the group, and the value that's associated with the group, maybe you still disagree with it, but the more you spend time with a group, the more you're likely to, for example, even if you think this behavior is bad, you're less likely to criticize it than to criticize something that the outgroup is doing. So again, it's more complicated than this. All that I want to say is that the more that we identify with a group, the higher the chances are that we start taking on the characteristics that are identified with the group. Number two, we all belong to multiple ingroups, and each one affects us differently. So let's talk about me. I have lots of different identities, right? So we can say like hitchhiker, like researcher, cyclist, beast builder, writer, blah, 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 blah. And I have lots of more identities. But a lot of us also kind of have hierarchies of identities, right? So maybe like my identity as a researcher is not as important as my identity as a hitchhiker, for example. Actually, no, let's compare hitchhiker and cyclist. So by cyclist, we mean like riding a bike. When I'm in the city, I identify as a cyclist because I'm riding my bike very often. But when I'm traveling, I identify more as a hitchhiker, so that like that kind of like goes like higher up in the hierarchy, and that identity is more activated. All that I want to say is that we have many different identities, and different identities are more important at different points in time. Also, when we have an identity that's important, I'm going to use the word activated or active, an active identity. Um, the certain traits that are associated with that identity for us are also kind of more active. So let's kind of like look at the example of a football stadium. So we can divide the people in this picture like according to all sorts of different kinds of questions. There's the question of who do you support? So if it's team A or team B, if you divide people according to that, you're going to get two huge polarized groups, right? But if you divide people by the sport that they love, then like everybody in there is in one group. Everyone there like loves football. And then like the out group are the people who don't love football, right? Or you could say like, what are you doing in the stadium? And then you have groups like the audience. You have groups like the players. You have the people who work at the stadium, right? And so like a person can be there, and they can be like a spectator, a fan of one team, and depending on what identity is more important at that time, it might influence their behavior. So if my identity as a fan of Team A is more important, I might be more likely to be aggressive to the other side because like this polarized identity is closer to my heart. But if my football lover identity is more important, then it's like I feel love for everybody, even if they're like somebody on the other side, perhaps, right? And so like the identity that's higher up on our list is more likely to influence us in these ways. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Does that like resonate? Can you think about things that have like similar situations in your life? Masha?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that it has to do with importance. I think some identities are just better weaponized than others, and also it has a lot to do with context in which they exist. For instance, what comes to my mind is when we studied like the violence between the people who are inmates of the penitentiary wards and the like the people who are officers there. They have these identities of inmates and officers which are polarized, but they also have other identities as I don't know, they're from the same city, maybe they're from the same social class, etc. And I don't agree that this identity, I am a prisoner or I am a ward, they're necessarily more important for them, but they're just better enforced by the institution, by the context. It's easier weaponized, so it is what dictates the majority of their interactions. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I love that you just spoiled the next 5 slides that I had. But good. Yeah, I think it's like for some people, I think this is also why I prefer the term like an active identity or an activated identity. Sometimes it's because it's like more important to you. Like maybe, for example, like fighting for one side of the team is more important to me, or like being kind of like one with all the other like fans is more important to me. And like that's the thing that activates it. It's something that's kind of under my control. It's something that's associated with my preferences. But um Uh, but like was just said, sometimes it's not something that's necessarily in our control. So, for example, oh, I see also Masha, Petruchen, you also have your hand raised. Is it something quick? If it's not something quick, can you write it in the chat? Uh, Masha, if you're saying something, we don't hear you. I saw your hand, but now your hand is gone. Okay, so I will move on. Yeah. So again, like our most active identity can affect how we feel. So for example, if one identity is like if our like fan identity is more active, we might be more aggressive to the other side. If our identity of being the staff member and not like a fan is more active, we might roll our eyes at all the heavy emotions that are happening. So again, like this is like it's more complicated than this, but like this is something that can definitely be in play. So like I'm talking for these examples, we were talking about like football game, right? Or if I go back, these are some of the identities that I listed before, which is kind of like things that I do, but I don't really get into many conflicts about these identities. Then there are some other identities, right? So these are identities that I've either associated with or people have associated me with. So, for example, Western, like coming from Canada and coming from the West, also Catholic, somebody who's connected to Russia, somebody who's queer, and somebody who's pro dialogue. So, what are some differences between these identities and the identities that I was listing before? Just like one word answer. You can write it in the chat or just like shout it through the mic. What are some of the differences here? I'm not seeing any takers, so I will answer. So these are like connected to large groups that act like large groups often. So like these are people that can often like be mobilized, or people that kind of like behave like or like that engage with a certain kind of group behaviors. They're like connected to social conflicts, and they're very, very easily activated for like a number of reasons. And again, like what one of the Mashas said, we don't always consciously choose which identities are going to be activated. So if we kind of go back to here, is there anything you notice about this picture? Anything interesting about it?
There is a polar bear.
I think it's a dog in the middle of the sheep. But like having an identity that's activated, like sorry, like activating an identity is sometimes as simple as just thinking that like you're different from like everybody around yourself, right? Like when differences are accentuated, like for example, if I'm in Canada, my like Western identity like is not activated at all. Um, but it's like definitely activated a lot more when I'm like outside of the West. Um, and the same thing with like being connected to Russia, because like for me, for example, like and especially with migration and with like not like being able to go back to St. Petersburg to live, like being outside of Russia has made me like also like definitely understand how important like that time was, and like how much that definitely shaped my identity like as a person, right? And so the contexts that we're in, like Masha said, like often also like influence which identities are activated or not, right? So like this dog here might not think so much about being a dog if he was around like lots of other dogs, right? Or if like every single animal was different, but like the fact that like there's all these other sheep are there, like makes it, well, who knows? But like if I was a dog, I would feel much more like a dog. Also another good point was that sometimes the like social like networks or like institutions around us encourage us to think of ourselves within one of our identities. So like it was talked about like with prisons, with officers, and with the inmates, right? And like it's the institution that's around them that's like constantly activating these identities again, and it's something that's not always beyond our control. So for example, yeah, we might one day be this very, very chill cat, and sometimes when an identity is activated, we start behaving very differently. We become a very unchill cat, in the sense that if, I don't know, like for me, for example, if we want to take these identities, this Western identity, when I started feeling in contexts where people draw attention to and make me feel more and more Western, I start getting a little bit tense, thinking, oh, am I going to be attacked for this? Am I going to have my privilege called out? Am I going to have to justify myself? Or even like I remember in Russia in like 2015, I was hitchhiking around, and because it was just after the annexation of Crimea, there's a lot of people that are like, like asking a lot of questions about like the West, because this was something that was also kind of activated, right? So, and it's not necessarily something that caused a conflict, but it made me more tense just because of the context that was around. Again, like now being connected to Russia, uh, being outside, like after the invasion started, especially if I'm working with my Ukrainian colleagues or if I'm working with certain kinds of activists, sometimes also being affiliated with Russia is also something that's kind of tense. Because it's like, oh, like, is somebody going to judge me? Is somebody going to like think I'm complicit in something? Like, am I going to trigger somebody because if I talk about my life in Russia or like the projects in Russia? Um, for example, like also pro dialogue. For me, this is a very important part of my practice, but also like oftentimes I identify as like a dialogue person, even if it's just like unconsciously, right? Because it's like such an important part of like the things that I do. And then there's some people that are like, no, like dialogue is not the answer right now. If you want to have dialogue with certain people, that means that you're part of the problem and you're part of the enemy. And I don't want to say that like they're right or they're wrong. I'm just saying that like uh, in situations like that where identity is part of the context that I'm being confronted with, or it's kind of being like that, I can go from being the chill cat to the unchill cat and be like, whoa, like what's happening? Like my nervous system is like a little bit extra activated. And it's not because of what I want to prioritize in that moment, but because of what the context or other people are prioritizing at that moment. And so the word trigger has a very specific like psychological meaning, which also has to do with like abuse and trauma. The way I'm using the word trigger as a metaphor for something that flips the switch here, when something is activated and we go from being chill cat to like not chill cat. And it's like there are certain things that flip the switch in that way. And the biggest one, possibly the biggest, one of the biggest things is definitely when we feel threat. And when we're talking about threat here, we're talking about a group threat. So if you identify heavily with a group, um, and if somebody attacks another person who's associated with that group, sometimes it means that I feel like that person attacked me. So if somebody like attacks somebody for being pro dialogue, my nervous system might activate and think that I am also under threat. And this makes me even less of a chill cat than I was before. And when this is like something this is something that can really like escalate like these group conflicts, because a lot of people that might not actually be in danger like start feeling like they're in danger, and like react differently, right? And they might, or if they see somebody like a member of another group as a threat, they might treat that entire group as a threat. So two people who might not have any issue with each other might start feeling each other like a threat, and like projecting all of that stuff like onto each other. Obviously, also it's like much more complicated than this, but it's like again, we have 2 hours, and so we don't want to like go too deep into this. But like an example here is like these are the twin towers that were destroyed in the September 11th terrorist attack in the States. And something that's like really interesting is there's a lot of like work and research done on this. Was that like people who weren't in New York who like had American citizenship, a lot of them also felt like reported feeling personally attacked or personally like in physical danger, like after this. And it wasn't just because it wasn't sure that if there would be more terrorist attacks. Like at first there was that fear, but then after that it was still like, oh, like somebody attacked a group member. It's like they attacked me. And then we had another thing that's interesting here is that even for people who like resist the group identity, so this is a picture of a stereotypical lefty hipster who might resist patriotism and might resist these kinds of this aspect of the American identity. A lot of those people after September 11th describe themselves, and this is like there's research again on this, describe themselves as like waving American flags and like feeling positive about the group. And so like having something that threatens your group is something that even if you resist like being associated with your in group, it's something that can like again like flip the switch and turn on these groupish tendencies. Again, it doesn't happen to everybody, but it happen like it can happen suddenly and unexpectedly for a lot of people. Uh, this can also like these kinds of group dynamics can result in a kind of polarization that's called effective polarization. So one kind of polarization is when like lots of people believe different things, and for a lot of people, like in terms of the research in North America and like when people were studying polarization, people thought that everyone thought something different, that everybody like they people on the other side they look completely different and they think completely different. But when people actually researched this question, they found no, actually most people think rather similar things. It's mostly like political elites or like activists or like really involved people who have like very strong beliefs that are different from each other. But most of the people are like in the middle, at least in like the United States and Canada. And they found a different type of polarization called affective polarization, which means not polarization of your thoughts, but polarization of your feelings. So when you're affectively polarized, you feel very negatively towards the other side. So we have this really interesting case in America where we have like the elephant and the donkey, which are symbols of the Democratic and the Republican Party. These are groups that are associated with ideology, right? Like liberal conservative, left right. But most of the people who associate with one or the other party believe very similar things. So you have a situation where people are very similar but hate each other because they think the other is so completely different and so threatening. And this is the kind of polarization that can like lead to conflict like very, very, very easily. Because when something is like, and this is again, like this is just an image from like the actual academic literature on like triggers and like trauma and stuff like this. Again, I don't want to like map out like this completely onto that, but all I want to say is that like when we feel this like feeling of threat, it can be something that's like very like sudden, right? It like switches us into like a very, very different brain mode. And when we start seeing the other like as dangerous in this way, or like or I should say like when we feel under threat, we might start having like blind spots, right? We might start seeing nuance less. We might start having tunnel vision this way. This is one cognitive impact of that. We might start seeing with a certain lens, right? Like certain facts might become obvious to us, but certain other facts might become completely invisible to us when we're in this kind of triggered, activated state. We might start thinking in terms of like black and white, like you're either with us or against us, something's entirely good or entirely bad. You might, like, this is also like a metaphor here, you might start entrenching yourself into your arguments, right? Like it's very hard to convince you of something otherwise. You prepare to defend yourself, you like dig a hole and you don't want to get out of it. Everything, like not everything, but a lot of things starts feeling like it's dangerous, even if it's like not technically dangerous, but it feels very, very dangerous to us. We might start thinking, if I could press a button, again, like if this polarization gets real, or the felt threat like gets really, really intense, we might start thinking, if I could push a button and like everyone on the other side would like stop bothering me or just stop being there, like maybe, I don't know, maybe I'd like to do that. And people who are on the other side stop seeming like people with different opinions. They might start seeming like something entirely inhuman. And yeah, I mean, I might say, no, thanks. I don't want to hang out with you. And I don't want to say that all animosity to another group is necessarily bad. Because, for example, if you're coming from like a position where you've suffered injustice or you've suffered oppression, or if you've suffered, right? Um, and if there's a power imbalance and there's somebody who is more powerful than you, like that was doing a lot of bad things to you, and if there's a group of people that were doing that to a group of people like you, like it's very like it's not just understandable, but there's a lot of people who would say that like it's very justified, in fact, to start like to direct that kind of aggression at them. So again, I don't want to say that like all of this is necessarily like 100% bad. And I'm not saying that it's like good either. I'm just saying that there's nuance here, right? And some people they're like, oh, this kind of some people would say that certain kinds of polarization is good because it might help an oppressed people to have more energy to resist the oppressor, right? That's a whole other kind of conversation. In the case with affective polarization, it's where people start thinking that the other is different, dangerous, monstrous, or inhuman, even without these like power asymmetries. Or maybe first one group is more powerful more generally, then like people from another group seem more powerful, right? So again, very, very complicated, but the cognitive process that's in our heads is like there's a lot of similarities there. Like not similarities, but like it's a process that can happen and it can lead directly to dehumanization, especially when we feel like there's threat that's going on. And because of that, because of all of these different cognitive patterns, all of these things that are happening in our brain, it becomes very hard to de escalate the conflict and to build peace in a certain way that we might want to build peace. Again, your preferences are your preferences, and we can talk about it afterwards. But these are dynamics that we have to be aware of and talk about. So there was going to be like a discussion question here about when you last felt your unchill cat, but we actually are running a little bit later than I had hoped, and so we're going to skip this and leave that for the discussion. But the last point that I want to talk about, and there's still so many points about like group dynamics and polarization that we could talk about, but like that would take forever. It's really hard to notice when group dynamics are activated. So when these things are impacting our brains, it's very hard to be aware that it's happening. So for example, I remember I was talking to somebody and I was defending a group that I felt very passionate about. And even though I researched this and like I work with this as a facilitator, as a peace building practicer, I still got into this mindset and I could see myself getting into that mindset and I could hear myself saying some kind of bullshit because of it. Uh, but um, but like I couldn't stop myself, right? So sometimes it's like it's hard to notice and sometimes it's hard to stop. And so I had to like wait until I came back down and then I could go back to that person and have a different kind of conversation. But it's like even when you're aware, it's still really hard to resist this stuff. It's like very, very complicated programming. And to be honest, sometimes I personally feel, and the other peace practitioners in this room, you can give your opinions later too. Sometimes I feel that like navigating the triggered brain is like half the work of peace building. How can we bring people from this triggered state into one of equilibrium where they can start seeing things again with nuance, start humanizing the other side, seeing that things are not as like black and white as we thought, um, and creating a space where people feel safe enough to do that is like it's a big part of a lot of different projects. Oh, and then fascism, right? Um, people talk a lot about fascism, but like the way that I understand this term is that fascism is like affective polarization to the extreme. It's where an in-group is so aggressive to the out-group that they take control of like state infrastructure and institutions and use it to marginalize, eliminate, or destroy the outgroup. So everything in the nation and the state infrastructure serves the in group, often in terms of race or religion or different things like this. Normally, actually, the technically fascism only technically applies to like racial and national like in group craziness. But like for me, anytime that like an in group becomes powerful enough to erase the other and like takes control of like institutions to do this, like it's pretty similar to fascism. So that's basically the endpoint. And it's interesting because again, like group dynamics and polarization aren't always like completely negative, you know? Like again, like feeling like we're part of a group can help us to mobilize to do certain things that we think are good in the world. But when it goes far enough, it puts us in this very, very unfortunate position. And yeah, and like not every single instance of polarization or like group dynamics also like emerges to fact like that doesn't like turn into fascism. But like group dynamics and polarization in this way like makes our brains work in a different way that's not necessarily rational, you know? And this, I don't know, if I could like if anyone's just like what's the one thing you would tell somebody who's like interested in starting to think about dialogue or peace building? It's this thing, it's like having a good argument is not going to help. It's not going to work. If somebody is feeling threatened and triggered and like they have blind spots and they're into this position and they dehumanize somebody, like you're not going to convince them with a good argument. Like maybe there's like a minority of cases that are like that, but for the most part, like trying to address this with like something like rational or like logical or like an argument is like not going to work because you're trying to address their mind when like a lot of this stuff is going on in their body, in their emotions, and in their nervous system. So, getting to dialogue in a polarized environment. If you want to have dialogue, we have to understand how these group dynamics, how these polarization stuff like emerges. For some reason, I have more pictures of cats. I'm not sure what that was about. Again, no one is entirely rational, and that's okay. and this includes you and me and whoever. So it's like, it's not also just like, I need to, oh, here's this polarized person and I have to like deal with them and I have to deal with their emotions and stuff. Like, no, like we're like, again, if we're saying that like rationality is better than irrationality, then like, again, this is like a judgment call, right? It's just a different system in our body that works in a different way. And if you want to work with a person or with a group that has this like trigger activation emotions, then like you have to work in a different way. So there's a couple different things, the ways that this can complicate dialogue. So maybe you want to have a dialogue with somebody, but the other person, they say they want to have a dialogue, but there's actually these different hidden, unseen motivations. Maybe they just like to, I don't know, like they like to express their group. Like if they feel very attached to their group, maybe they just want to express their group, like affiliation or their group identity. And being in a conflict with you is not actually because like they care about it or they care about the issue at stake, but they want to express their loyalty to the group. They might also like, or they might for the first one, they might want to express this to you. Another time, they might use this conversation to express their loyalty to their group. So it's almost like something that's kind of performative, right? Where their group is an audience and they basically perform their group identity and they secure their position in the group. And so like the conversation, the dialogue isn't always actually about the thing you're talking about, but sometimes it's a way for a person to feel more, yeah, secure in their group. Again, it might also just be a way for them to feel better about themselves. Like, oh, like I'm a vegetarian and I'm gonna like argue about like I'm gonna argue with somebody who like eats meat, and it might be less about engaging with that person than like feeling better about yourself as a vegetarian. And in cases where the conversation is public, they might use the conflict to increase their status in the group. Just like, oh, like, look how good of a vegetarian I am. Like, look how good of, I don't know, like a Polish person I am. Like, I'm in this conflict, and like that shows how like good of a group member I am. So this it can also derail a dialogue because a person might be afraid of being rejected by the group if they show that they're willing to talk, right? So I love this meme. One person says, I have strong opinions. And then the person says, are they based on reality? And then the person says, they are based on how I feel in my heart. And the heart says, I'm terrified that if I research and form opinions based on reality, a wedge will be driven between me and my community, and I will lose my family and friends. So sometimes we are so embedded into our groups that the thought of being disloyal to the group or the thought of being distanced from our group is something that feels so destabilizing and so scary that we might not even want to listen to the other side, right? And so group belonging and meeting our needs is more important than like trying to see like the world more clearly. And again, like people have reasons for that. You know, maybe a person is very vulnerable, right? And being in that group helps them to feel emotionally regulated. And so it's not that, oh, this person is stupid and like they just want to like think about the group. Like sometimes it's like very complicated, right? And different people have different contexts. And so sometimes a person argues with you or is in a conflict with you, not because they actually care about so much about what's being said, but because they're afraid of losing their group and the people they care about. So another way that these instigate like that this group dynamics like intensifies conflict on like a person to person basis is that you're seen as a threat to the other person's self or their group. And in cases like that, they might be more likely to fight you, to be aggressive to you, to not listen to what you have to say, or to build up walls around you. So obviously, there's like lots more different things that can happen. But when I built this presentation, I was thinking more about like a person to person kind of basis, and these are some things uh, that are like that. So what are some things that you can do either yourself when you're in a conversation, or if you're facilitating a group dialogue where these dynamics come up. One, if you see that there's a conflict that's really hard to, where it seems like, I don't know, it's kind of like there's like a joke where if there's like a couple that's been together for a long time and they start arguing about the dishes, like who is doing the dishes or like washing the dishes after food, and it becomes something that's like really crazy. They say that they're talking about the dishes, but they're actually talking about something else, right? Like it's the same thing when we have conflicts with each other, where we might say that we're talking about like ideology or like a conflict or whatever, but actually sometimes it's like the group dynamics that are like impacting that. So if we want to engage with this as peace builders, either on one-on-one conversation or if we're facilitating a group, we have to be aware that sometimes a conflict is motivated by group dynamics rather than the thing that we're talking about. And if we think that that's happening, then we have to act differently. We can't just, again, try to convince somebody or like offer a good argument. There are other things that we can do. So, for example, because again, a lot of these are based on like these triggers, sometimes you just need to take a pause and just like take some deep breaths or just like wait it out, right? Sometimes that's like good enough. Sometimes it's just like a first step that has to happen to kind of like just kind of de-escalate the situation. It's also really good to understand what's at stake for them because a person, for example, might be afraid of losing their community and they're going to behave differently in a conflict than a person who is looking for status, right? And so, depending on this thing that is at risk for the other person, they're going to behave differently. And so, like, we need to understand what is it that the person is actually worried about so we can actually address it. Maybe they see you as a threat because you're part of a different group. And maybe you don't realize that at first. So a big part of like something we have to do in dialogue is like understand where they feel threatened and trying to like de-escalate that threat. Maybe one way to do that is to activate other identities, perhaps a common identity that you share. So if there's like an active identity that like separates you, like is there something that you haven't? This is actually really like a very famous practice for like that like a lot of peace builders do. Like for example, this is something that's often used in women's dialogues. So if women from different groups in conflict come together, often the initiative will try to activate their common identity as women. And that way, like try to find ways for them to like talk to each other and then like work together against the conflict. Speaking in their language. So if their group values like has like I don't know, like if you're going to talk to a conservative, you might frame your discussion in terms of like traditions or like things that are valuable to them. And if you're talking to somebody who's more like leftist, you might talk more about like diversity or like solidarity. And like these are also things that can open up doors into the conversation and like resist the polarizing tendencies. Um, I see there's like, uh-huh. Masha's also asking about people with neurodivergence. I think that's like like whether like these findings apply to like also people with like neurodivergence. I'm not sure. I think it's like something I'm sure. I don't know. Actually, I don't even know. Like my assumption like would be that things might work differently, but I don't know that literature. So I think this is a really important point. And the last thing that I want to talk about is giving them a way out. Because if a person really kind of dug down into their argument and they see that actually they might not be entirely correct, sometimes it makes it easier for them to exit the conflict if you like give them a way out that like helps them save face with their group. And if you do that, sometimes they're also able to like step back with grace. So again, it's really hard to do this kind of thing if you're not in like if you don't have some kind of equilibrium or like balanced state of mind yourself. So like this is about self-care. It's about Are you having a dialogue when you're really hungry? Are you having a dialogue when you're stressed or triggered? Like doing like when you're in that state, like all of these things are like much harder. And so like any dialogue has to first start thinking about like your mind, your body, your emotions, whether you're triggered. Uh, Sometimes it'll be hard for you to talk to certain like members of certain groups without being triggered. So uh, maybe think about like, should you be the one having that dialogue? Maybe you want to have a dialogue with like somebody else supporting you. Like there's like lots of different things here, but it's like you're not a robot, you know? Like all of these things also affect you. And so like before you do any kind of initiative or any kind of like conversation where you feel like there's a big chance of like escalation or polarization or triggering, think about yourself too. It's not just about how do I make the other person feel safe and comfortable. It's also about like how do I take care of myself in this context. So there again are so many more other things we could talk about with this. Like it's such a huge topic. I just wanted to give like some small like introduction to some of this stuff and also some tips and how it kind of applies to dialogue. But now it is time for discussion. We don't have actually too much time. We have 15 minutes according to the schedule. Obviously, like we missed out on like 10 or 15 minutes because I dropped out. So I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer. But yeah, that is that.
Josh, there was a question in the chat from Yulia. Where is the division line between various groups you belong to and yourself?
I would ask, I don't know, so I would say it doesn't matter like to me like the division line is like your skin, right? Like you're not your group. And like every group is just a bunch of people that are together, right? What makes them a group is the story that they tell themselves about themselves, right? And so for some people, the story that they tell themselves is I am completely part of my group, right? And like the group is like me. But for other people, they tell themselves a story where this is my group and I'm here and I'm in it, but I'm not like absorbed by it, right? So I think different people have a different line in that way. And for some people, all of their groups are kind of important to them, but for other people, one or two groups that are like constantly activated. So it really depends on the person. Masha, your microphone is off.
Right. I just wanted to answer also this question from a more sociological point of view that it also depends on the rules of inclusion and exclusion in the group. Because in some groups, you can get away with being being something else. And if you take, for instance, a totalitarian sect, they control everything or the majority of things that are you. So you cannot just differentiate between yourself and the group in this context, or at least it's you have less space to do so. So I think it also depends on the group.
And are there any other also just questions, comments? Maybe something from the presentation made you think of a story that you want to share. Yeah, right now is just time and space for anyone to contribute to the discussion. Dasha.
Do you mind opening slides again?
Yes.
Because so first I wanted to ask like the last few slides where you say what to do. A couple back. From which setting are we coming from? Who are we and who's the person that we are discussing? Yeah.
So this is like I was thinking about if you're a person who's in dialogue with somebody and you think that the other person is polarized or that they're triggered or that their identities are activated in a way that makes dialogue difficult. These are things that you can do to make the dialogue richer.
So we are participants of this dialogue. We are.
You could you could do it either as a participant or as a facilitator. But if you do it as a participant, it's harder.
Because I think I got caught by the understand what's at stake for them, as in how do we understand this? Because that's like our internal judgment of what is at stake for them, right? Depending on
Mm.
how much we know about the person, and then like it's also our own bias of what is at stake for them.
But you can talk to them about it, right? Like you can ask them certain questions like, oh, there's this thing that you don't like, or not that you don't like, or like there's this thing that like that seems dangerous or bad. What would happen if that thing wasn't resisted? Like what would change in your life? Or like some kind of question like this. Like, oh, like, like um if these people keep doing the thing that they're doing, maybe they're going to like give my children bad values, right? And so for them, like it's their children that's at stake that they feel, right? Or they say, oh, like if we don't stop them, they're going to hurt me. They're thinking that their physical like safety is at stake, right? And sometimes they're not going to say it out loud, and so this is something that's that like only becomes clearer like over like a long conversation or like over years of like long conversations, right? So and this is like every single one of these tips, like there's like a book, like one or more books written about them, right? So it's like we can't like go like super deep into them, but like that's one example, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Masha.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. So I've got several questions from earlier slides, but I wonder the most now about how to give people a way out or something like this. Last point of your presentation, because I like the idea, but I would like some like examples or strategies, techniques, tactics, like how could it be, and what could you please like explore it more, explain it more?
Hmm. So, for example, like I grew up in a very religious community, and so for some people, they felt like they needed to have certain arguments in order to be a good person. Like that being a good person like involves like having to like attack certain things because those are like evil, right? And if we're having a conversation with that kind of person, and I can sense that they don't want to keep fighting, but they feel like they have to, like to kind of like otherwise there's going to be some moral consequence. I might say, for example, I might highlight like the things from that religious tradition that emphasize not resisting evil, but like showing mercy or like showing grace or something like this. And so I like frame a way out of the of like the conflict that is consistent with their beliefs and with their like value system, and that allows them to step back without feeling like they're a bad person. Does that make sense?
Does this mean I need to be very um, aware? I need to know like the specifics of their beliefs
So in this,
to
mhm,
to help them out, like because what if I don't?
mhm.
What should I do then?
Like it really depends on the case, Like again, I think the mastery of dialogue is being able to have conversations that become a safe enough space for certain things to like emerge in conversation. But like I also believe that certain people are going to have better dialogues with certain groups. So like there's certain groups that I work with because like I know them better, right? And if somebody wants me to facilitate a dialogue with groups that I don't know very well, like I might hesitate to do that because I'm like, maybe I could recommend somebody who knows the context a bit more. Because when you don't know the context, you have less choices that you can make that will help make the conversation that will help you like reach your goal, I guess. So like I can't just give you an answer to that question, right? Like it's like maybe you can't, maybe you can't help that person find a way out. And it's like that's unfortunate. Maybe you'll have to try something else. Or like yeah, like there's this unfortunately sometimes you have people in a conflict who see themselves as like big and powerful and with big status. And some facilitators will give them a way out that will still make them seem like they're cool. So it doesn't affect their reputation, right? So that's like one way of like giving someone a way out. But other people might think, oh, that's like bullshit because like who cares if their reputations are lost? Their reputations are bullshit, right? So also the values that you have are going to impact like what options you have working with peace building. Alan.
So I'm interested in what you think about, where it's all the example of a Black person in America where, you can't, sort of that's when you're talking about skin before it actually. So with a Black person and sort of it doesn't stop at skin where the society just sees that's like an identity that everybody sees just based on your skin color. And it could be a same thing with gender. Someone looks at you just based on your, how you physically look, whether you're a man or a woman. And just how do you, because what you just said is like I could never mediate with a group of women, and I'm not being facetious here. I probably couldn't because I've never been a woman. It's a group, quote, a group I don't know so well or as well as women would know women. But the same would be with, a group of Black people or any other group where, there's one characteristic that is it's a core characteristic that people either then have all these other thoughts about what that means, mistaken thoughts, mistaken assumptions. So I'm not articulating this so well, but I think you know what I'm asking, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that this question of who can facilitate conflicts with certain groups is like really important. Um, this is really important also with my Ukrainian colleagues because uh, there's this big question of whereas like a lot of them now feel like triggered in a way that they didn't feel triggered before the invasion. And so there's this question of what processes can they facilitate now because they're not impartial also, right? So like and then for some people it's like, okay, like would a white should a white person facilitate a conversation where it's only like Black people or like racialized people? And it's like these are like really important conversations. And I would also add that one thing that you can do is like facilitate in teams, like you can, if there's like different people, like if there's different groups that are involved, and if you don't feel comfortable with a certain context, then like facilitate with somebody else also who like has a bit more familiarity with the context. Um, that's if you're like a group facilitator, right? But sometimes you're just like in a dialogue one-on-one with somebody who has a very different lived experience than you. And hopefully the dialogue gives you an opportunity to learn more about them. Masha, so I'm seeing the same people are always raising their hands, and like so, like Masha, like definitely please go. But like then if somebody else also would like to add something to the conversation, we also want to. We don't have too much more time left, so we want to make sure there's also time for you. Masha.
Yeah, this is what I was gonna say. Like, if somebody else wanna ask question, please go ahead. because I just heard this like pause, and I was afraid that Josh will say like, okay, goodbye. So my question is about pause. Sorry,
Pause. Mhm.
pause. Yeah. I recently facilitated a conversation between a few groups, like 3 groups, about very intense conflict, considering sexual harassment, and one of the group was very triggered by the time it took another group to respond. And this is interesting for me because I think that sometimes pause gives us ability to like regroup and to see the situation a bit differently, like wider view and so on. But sometimes it seems like if we don't continue conversation, people kind of like freeze in their point of view. So like the time kind of consolidates their position, and it's harder after time. It's harder to have a dialogue with them. What do you think about this? Like, what are you talking about? Like, is it a pause like for a minute, or is it pause for like a day, or how do you? What are your ideas about it?
So again, I think you have to figure out your priorities first and foremost, because for some people, being in a conversation with certain people does not feel like a safe space, right? And you have to think about, and goes back to like red and green lines that we were talking about before, and it's just like, you have to think like, I think that one of the worst things that a dialogue practitioner can do is to say that everybody has to be in dialogue all the time, and that this is like the main thing that we need to be doing, because like maybe you need to take a pause for 3 years before you feel safe and comfortable enough to come back to something. If it's like with a family member or like with a community that's going to last for a long time, right? There's no rule. And I think one of the worst things also is to be like, no, dialogue is good for you, so you need to be in dialogue with me, when like the other person wants to take a pause. And that's also can be like this really big problem. So I don't, yeah, I like to see this like in the same way that at the beginning I said, okay, like if you want to like think about building a certain kind of piece, you have to not just think about group dynamics, but also about um like power asymmetries, narratives, um, needs, and whether they're met or not. Like in the same way, like dialogue is just like one tool in the toolbox. And sometimes, if you want to build peace, sometimes it means like activism and mobilizing and protest and like resistance. Like that can also be a path to resist a certain kind of conflict. So it's like it's good to become aware of like these different paths and become like also, and this is also part of like the journey of like a peace builder is like knowing when it might be better to do like one thing or another, and it depends on your priorities, right? Because for one person, punching a fascist is like what you need to do, but for another person, like punching a fascist is like makes resolving the conflict harder, depending on how they see things, right, and what their perspective is. So again, like what's important for you in this moment? Like what's your priority? And like, will a pause help you get there to your goal, or will it not? Masha?
Yeah, I've got more questions.
Maybe like let's see
Yeah,
if
let somebody other
uh,
somebody else.
I might also just like start asking people's names to see like if you have like Anna, Anya. How about you? How are you feeling about all this?
Yes, I'm feeling good, but I understand that I forgot English language. So now all my brains are concentrated in understanding what you are saying. And I understand that the power of my brains now it's not so big to produce my own questions about it. So I'm just absorbing, just listening to you. It was very interesting. Maybe if there will be next time something like this,
Mhm.
I will remember all my English words and ask the questions. But it was very interesting. Yes, thank you.
It was good to see you.
Yeah.
Might be also interesting because like my colleagues here, Sergey and Seva and Katya, they also have experience with facilitating dialogues with different groups. And I don't know if you guys have anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to challenge about the conversation we've had so far.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Josh, for your presentation. It was really interesting to see your perspective and your vision on the group dynamic. I'm just sharing my experience, and yeah, sometimes and the dialogue starts from the process of selection of the participants. And this is a challenging process and actually challenging issue for all of us who is involved into dialogue. So we are actually choosing who will be in dialogue. And sometimes we are trying to get involved as many different people as possible. I mean, with different backgrounds, yeah, in terms of gender, of course, in terms of other identities or countries of the origin, and etc. But at the same time, those people who we can reach in the context of authoritarian regime, sometimes these are people who are ready for dialogue. Either they used to get to be in dialogues, or they are ready, they are open to listen the counterparts, to listen the people from the other side. And the role of facilitator in this moment is somehow to provoke. Yeah, and sometimes, for instance, we had a group which was really very kind to each other, which were really, like non-provocative, but trying to be as kind as possible, not touch upon the some sensitive topic, or trying to obvinit, to blame the other side, yeah. And our role was somehow to provocate. And in this moment, the facilitator becomes a participant, trying somehow to provocate, trying somehow to push the dialogue. My question to you: what do you think about this? Is it normal? Is it always like this? I mean, trying somehow to push and to get people talk, and or maybe it depends on the group, and it depends on the situation, and of course on the situation in authoritarian regime.
Yeah, thank you for the question and for your experience as well. I think that like it depends on the goal of your process. Like if the goal is to dig deeper into the conflict, and if nobody wants to talk about it, then yeah, like the facilitator has to find a way to unearth these things. I also am a firm believer in what I call the facilitator hat. So it's like being a facilitator, you can either put on the hat, you know, it can come on and it can come off. And so some people believe that the facilitator has to always be neutral, always be have your facilitator hat on. But I think that sometimes you have like a lot of results from being like, okay, now I'm taking off my facilitator hat and I'm going to speak like this, you know, and not just be this like perfect neutral blah blah blah, because that's also kind of an illusion, like this neutrality. But again, it depends on your style. But I think uh, that yeah. Um, that's this can be depending on like if I was working with people with trauma, then maybe I wouldn't do that. But if I was working with all these polite NGO activists who and like peace people who want to say that they're all doing fine, then maybe I'd be like, you know. So again, it depends, but I think it's a completely legitimate thing, and I think your experience also shows that. And I don't know, Sergey or Katya would also have something to add from their experience of working with groups and identities.
No, me not today.
Well, I maybe agree with Katya and Seville. I'm not really talking a lot about my experience, but just want to add that it's very complicated to organize the space, such as, to provoke the open discussion about the very traumatic topic. Yeah, but I do think that specifically in my case, it was important for me also as a participant of such dialogues. When at last I found a space where I could openly discuss very complicated things. Yeah, not just try to be polite to others. Yeah, but also somehow argue, discussing uh, openly, discussing complicated things. And I do believe that, if we see the space of this communication or dialogue, in the conflict context, such as, to bring people together, uh, try, yeah, to show them that people from other side are also people, not just, that any awful enemies, I don't know, but they're also people. This is not enough. I think we should have to go deeper, but that needs to be organized very carefully, of course.
Thank you, Sergey. In that case, I think maybe we will close if nobody else has anything to add. And again, I just want to repeat again that dialogue isn't always the answer in all circumstances. And I've been working a lot with groups who kind of consider like I work like in Canada, I was working with like ideological conflicts, people on the left and on the right. And for example, like here, like I've been hanging out with a lot of and like working with groups that are kind of consider themselves more left. And in those groups, some of the decisions that they make involves seeing peace as a matter of fighting the right people rather than necessarily having like dialogue with the right people or having some conversation, like or having some combination of that. And so again, I don't want people to walk away from here thinking that like, oh, we have to like, if I want to build peace, I have to like, I don't know, resolve like group dynamics or whatever, you know. But it's like if you find that you're trying to work on some kind of peace project or peace process, and there's resistance that you think might be coming from, like, that might be generated by group dynamics, then you can start thinking about these kinds of things. And you have to decide whether it's right for you in your situation, and know that other peace builders might think very differently than you in that context. So thank you. And Masha, what about you?
Yeah, I still got a few questions. So I wanted to ask you about one of your last points in presentation, as a like you need to be very like stable to facilitate a dialogue or something like this. Like in my community, I see that people are kind of more and more exhausted by all the war and political situation and here in Georgia and all the immigration issues and so on and so on. And it kind of looks like we as a community use like all the power of psychologists have to support us. They try to find like psychologists to support them and so on. And it's like I don't see as much stable people as needed to facilitate hard discussions or something like this. So I wonder, is it something like a brochure, I don't know, tools, like if everybody feel bad and have no like energy what to do, because the only thing I see we can do is to facilitate in teams. Like, okay, today I'm like less energetic, but you a bit more and so on. But it's kind of like a big question for me, like how can we like making things better if we are so exhausted by everything is so hard for us. It's like a bit philosophical question.
It like kind of feels silly to like, okay, so like I like these presentations, but like I sometimes I don't like that there's this kind of like thing where it's like, oh, like here's the expert, like, you know, like they have answers for everything. It's just like, oh my gosh, yeah, yeah, that's a thing. If I said that you need to be stable to facilitate, I apologize for that formulation. I just think that it's harder to facilitate when we're not in a state of equilibrium. And I think it's like an argument for self-care and for community care, and against forcing ourselves to facilitate because we think it's the right thing to do, if we don't feel like we're in the best place, because I think also that can be really irresponsible and that can also do harm. Not sure.
Yeah, I want to share something that my therapist told me when I was conducting interviews with people that were hard for me because I didn't agree or because they represented something that I perceive as threatening or unjust. But I still needed and wanted to understand their viewpoints and their like where they're coming from. So I think it has a lot to do with dialogue also. So what my therapist taught me to do is to pay attention to my emotions, because in a way, when we feel something in a dialogue, sometimes it means that the other person is feeling something like on the mirror side of that. So, for instance, if I feel threatened, then my counterpart might feel like the necessity to be big and to impose on me and also threatened. Or if I need if I feel disgusted, then the other person maybe is feeling something like a need to be likable, to be more likable, and vice versa. So I guess you can use your emotional state also as an instrument and as uh like a thermometer of what the other one is feeling. And also, yeah, I think the first thing you need to do always is to regulate yourself, and then the other parties will also sometimes follow if they can.
Thanks, Masha. I sent the name of a documentary into the chat, White Right Meeting the Enemy. And it's a really good example of something kind of like this, where it's about a British woman of Pakistani descent who is like a feminist who decided she was going to go to America to talk to white supremacists. And it's about the conversations that she has with them and with people who might see her as like the enemy. And so I don't like it's a really good example of somebody who is in a vulnerable position and who still has conversations and like it's really really interesting. So like just because you're in a vulnerable position, whether it's like cognitively or psychologically or like socially because of like your like where you are like intersectionally, um, like it doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible. It just means that you have to take precautions, or you have to like take care of yourself as well as that. Aliona.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to your point about where you said that dialogue is not always the answer. Did you mean that not every conflict should be resolved, or that dialogue is not the only way to resolve it?
Yeah, the second one. I think that like for example, we take like Israel and Palestine. There are lots of like dialogue initiatives, but like dialogue by itself is not going to change the very particular power dynamics in that region, right? So it has to be complemented by other things as well.
You mean that like a peace dialogue in a student camp doesn't stop the bombs?
Exactly.
But what if I think that when I think of a dialogue between the parties, it's also the question of identifying the parties, right? And then like this is a very difficult conflict to dismantle, but if I manage to identify and invite the right parties to the dialogue, like somebody from Hamas, for example, right? And in this case, would dialogue be a solution?
So dialogue, certain like obviously also like dialogue is not one thing. There are different kinds of dialogues that are like that can do different things, and there's different like formats. But like for example, the Oslo Accords in like the early like I don't know like decades ago, that was a dialogue that brought together the Palestinian and the Israeli elites. And that dialogue was successful in that they were able to sign a certain deal, but it didn't have buy-in with like the general population. And like because it didn't include like other kinds of things, like it didn't stop, right? So it's like there's there's like that context where maybe it's not just like this one dialogue. You need to have like lots of other different like dialogues like simultaneously that are aimed at different things. But also I think it's like if there's like a military industrial complex that is like lobbying government powers to like continue to sell weapons or to like bombs or whatever, right? I think that that's not something you can stop by like talking to the right person. Sometimes it is, and that's great, but sometimes it's a whole system and structure that has to be like deconstructed.
But in order for it to be deconstructed, do I have to have a dialogue with the right person to convince them?
Maybe it might be a dialogue. Maybe it might be a boycott. Maybe it might be a general strike. Maybe it might be like XYZ. And a dialogue also presupposes people being open and wanting to do dialogue, and the people who need to be there might not be in that place. And so you might need to do other things to encourage them or incentivize them to do that. right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there were dialogues between like Ukraine and Russia until 2022 that failed because like you weren't able to incentivize Russia, like according to the Ukrainian side, to like treat this, treat the situation seriously, right? So there had to be something else, like for example, sanctions or something else, you know? So like these are different things that people say. I'm not saying that it's all correct, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
like I think that it's um not good to imagine that dialogue is like the necessary. It's like you building a house and you want to use a hammer to build everything.
Mm-hmm. It sounds to me that it's also like um there are stages.
Mhm.
It's like you probably can't solve it. Like dialect can be a part of it, but
Mhm.
there should be a right time and right parties, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And like I read a book by Adam Kahane. You probably know him. Collaborating with the enemy,
Mhm.
and that was like when I first had a fight with a friend in like since childhood, you know. And it basically said fighting is can be appropriate, like
Mhm.
it's all right. And I understood that we have such a taboo on fights. Like we, by we again, I identify myself with some group of people who are like from good families, you know, like polite and all that. And having a conflict sometimes is a way to show the other party that you are serious, that you care about
Mhm.
something, and to show the line, right? To show the border. So
Mhm.
yeah, maybe that also that is also true that not every conflict should be immediately resolved. You should probably stay in the conflict to kind of to show that this is important.
Mhm. Yeah, and
What do
this
you
kind of
think
goes
about that?
back to this goes back to actually the last seminar through this platform was given by Vadim Romashov, and he was talking about agonistic dialogue, which is about trying to like you don't escape the conflict. You don't just like stop the conflict. You find like often people use the word productive, but I don't really like that word. I haven't found something else to I don't know, no other word comes to mind, but almost like a productive way for conflict to continue, right? So you're not trying to like resolve everything, like it's impossible, but it's like how do you find a less destructive way for diversity to exist? So I think like that's one part of it. Also, some people see that in order to convince a powerful party to participate in a process that will involve them giving up power, you have to make them hurt. And some people might use violence for that, like violent resistance. Other people might use like strikes, protests, sanctions, stuff like that. But some people see that as a legitimate tool to bring somebody to the table and to make them take the table serious. But then again, that's kind of like on a bigger level rather than like on
Yeah,
a person to person level.
that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. We're nearly 30 minutes over time. That's cool. I don't know. I'm obsessed about this kind of stuff, so I'm always happy to talk about it. Um, uh, I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Um, this was the last of our three planned follow-up presentations for the Gori Facilitation School of No Border Space. And I don't know if Seva or Kati had any words to sign off from the organizational side, or if we can just close.
Yeah, I think we spent more time as it was planned, and it demonstrates that it was really intense and deep discussion today. It was not only the presentation, but also most of the discussion, which we very appreciate. And yeah, so yeah, let's sum up then. Yeah, first of all, thank you, George, for your presentation, and that you managed to to come back and to follow the presentation. Otherwise, we would ended up in discussing conflict stuff and etc., which is also very important, but it's not the main issue and main topic of our today's meeting. But this shows that there are too many topics, sensitive topics, which we actually should also touch upon. Maybe we will do something later, but in this year, 2024, we finalize with Josh session, with Josh presentation. We finalize our No Border Space program. We're looking forward towards new discussions in the coming year. So thank you for your interest, and thank you for coming and joining us today, to all of our participants. Yeah, and be in touch. You have all our, I guess, lots of you have our contacts. You can easily contact us through social media, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
happy holidays if you're celebrating or if you're
Thank
able to
you.
celebrate.
Thank you very
Thank you, you
much.
too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye. I have some technical question to Katya and Josh.
Mhm.
Josh, Katya, maybe you know better. Now we should record. I mean, we should record it into the computer. And my question, I just stopped recording. Sorry, just one minute. I forgot to stop it. Just a moment. Where it
Да,
is?
выключи запись
Я
просто.
просто ищу, где это. Подожди секундочку. Where it is? Oh my God. It's here. Stop.
Маша,
Should
пока.
Окей, пока-пока. Так, stop recording. Just a moment. Stop recording.